Hi, I'm Adler, co-founder of CoMake, and today I'm excited to share with you the open source standard SDK and the open source framework standard knowledge language. They're both powerful tools for building software integrations. So I'm going to walk through an example of creating an events calendar app through just one script for a city. I'm going to use New York as an example. And so for this app, I want to add events that are listed publicly on different ticketing systems like Ticketmaster, StubHub, SeatGeek. So first, this example is going to walk through kind of the traditional way of doing that, where I would start out by researching APIs, what different parameters they have support for, and then look for an SDK or client library in my language of choice, which right now is JavaScript in Node. Um, and so here I found an SDK for TypeScript, an unofficial one for SeatGeek, and I actually couldn't find one for StubHub. There's a really old one for an old version of the API, but I couldn't use that. So then we initialize each SDK and write the code to make the request that we want for each API. Right. So we want to get events from Ticketmaster and get events from SeatGeek. Right, it's different per SDK. You have a different initialization process with different, potentially different security credentials and different functions to call per SDK. The response of each API will be different as well. So Ticketmaster has a unique data format they respond with. SeatGeek has a different one, and as well as we don't have any TypeScript support. These particular SDKs don't have support for that. I know a lot of developers like to use TypeScript to make their code a bit safer. And in general, we have to spend a lot of time writing custom code per integration, right? Once you actually get these responses, then processing them to work with the data in the way that we want it to be. We have to write code for that. So instead of doing all that, we can save a lot of time with standard SDK. And standard SDK provides an SDK for any API through the use of open source standardized API specifications like OpenAPI or GraphQL schemas or OpenRPC schemas. These specs are often publicly available and otherwise they're pretty easy to create. And it uses these API specs to know how to send properly formatted web requests, messages, queries, or etc. to the APIs that you want your application to integrate with. And it automatically creates a typed namespace per integration. So see here I'm importing each of the OpenAPI specs for these different tools, SeatGeek, StubHub, Ticketmaster, building my standard SDK with those. And here now I get a Ticketmaster namespace, a StubHub namespace, and a SeatGeek namespace. And it gives you a function to execute for every operation in the API spec. So here I have a search events operation that comes from the Ticketmaster OpenAPI spec. And it's typed with all of the right parameters that are possible that are listed in the OpenAPI spec. Same with StubHub, this operation, and same with SeatGeek, this search events operation. The first parameter that I give it here is going to be any parameters I want to supply that match the API spec. And then the second argument for each of these is any security credentials or other configuration that's necessary for that API. So then what we get in response here is we're always going to get an Axios response. And Axios is a popular library for sending web requests. And so this kind of a standard response that we have here, but we're still going to get a different unique data format per API. So in total, right, we've reduced dependencies. We're only using one SDK. We've gained type support. We've simplified our code quite a bit, right? We only have to know, we only use the functions defined through the OpenAPI specs. But this method still requires custom code per integration to supply the right parameters, right? This one takes city, this one takes this queue for query parameter. And we still have to write custom code to work with the unique data formats each API returns. Ideally, we could use a unified API to interact with this data in a common model. So for example, like schema.org, which is an ontology often used when websites want to represent event information. So we can do that with SKL. SKL is short for Standard Knowledge Language. And Standard Knowledge Language uses abstractions to further simplify our code and give ourselves a true unified API for events to power our application. Now, Standard Knowledge Language uses sets of declarative schemas, which serve as abstractions on the data formats and capabilities of each software tool. You see me importing those schemas here. So schemas are made up of nouns, verbs, and mappings. Nouns represent standard data formats, verbs represent capabilities like API endpoints, and mappings are used to translate between verbs and nouns. So we just combine those schemas, supply those schemas to standard SDK, and now standard SDK has this SKQL thing attached to it, which stands for Standard Knowledge Query Language Engine, which we can use to execute the verbs in our schema. Here I'm using this getEvents verb and supplying it with the right parameters according to its schema that was in our JSON here. And Standard Knowledge Query Language Engine will use the mappings that we've supplied to automatically translate these verb parameters into the properly formatted request for each API, then translate the unique response of each API back into our chosen ontology, which, as I described earlier, was the schema.org event ontology. So now we have standardized data. These Ticketmaster events, StubHub events, and SeatGeek events, they're all standardized in the same format from each integration, and we have a truly unified API that's much simpler and easier to work with than dealing with multiple APIs like our first example. We'd love if you could try it out. You can read more of the documentation. Go to comake.io/skl. Thanks.